Before we begin this fascinating story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss updates about royal family stories and exclusive insights from behind palace walls. Morning mist hung low over the Scottish Highlands as Thomas MacGregor stood at his usual post outside Balmoral Castle. He had served as a royal guard for 23 years, and in all that time, he had never felt the kind of anger that now coursed through his veins. The ancient stone walls of the castle had witnessed centuries of royal history. But what was happening inside those walls now felt like a betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. Thomas remembered the day. Queen Elizabeth passed away like it was yesterday. September 8th, 2022, had changed everything for everyone who worked at Balmoral. The Queen had loved this place more than any of her residences. She had spent her happiest summers here, walking the grounds, fishing in the River Dee, and finding peace in the wild beauty of the Scottish countryside. Her private quarters in the castle had been her sanctuary, a place where she could truly be herself away from the constant demands of royal duty. For decades, those rooms had been sacred. The Queen's personal belongings, her photographs, her books, and her most cherished possessions remained exactly as she had left them. Even King Charles had been careful about disturbing his mother's private spaces. The staff had maintained everything with reverence, dusting the shelves, keeping fresh flowers in the vases, just as the Queen would have wanted. It was more than just a set of rooms. It was a memorial to a beloved monarch who had given her entire life to service. But now, everything had changed. Queen Camilla had begun spending time in those private quarters. At first, it had been innocent enough. She needed a quiet place to rest during their summer visit to Balmoral. The castle was full of guests, and she wanted somewhere peaceful. Thomas had tried to understand. He had tried to be reasonable. After all, Camilla was now queen, and perhaps she had every right to use any room in any royal residence. However, something about it did not sit right with him or with many of the other long-serving staff members. These were not just any rooms. They were Queen Elizabeth's most personal spaces. The late Queen had kept her diary on the writing desk by the window. She had sat in that very chair, looking out over the mountains, making decisions that affected millions of people. Her reading glasses still rested on the bedside table. Next to a half-finished book she would never complete, Margaret, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for 35 years, had been the first to notice the changes. She'd come to Thomas one evening, her eyes red from crying. Small things had been moved. A cushion was in a different position. Some of the Queen's personal photographs had been turned face down. It might have seemed trivial to an outsider, but to those who had cared for these rooms with devotion, every detail mattered. The other guards had started talking. In the staff dining hall, during their breaks, the conversation always came back to the same topic. Why did Camilla need to use those specific rooms? Balmoral had 50 rooms. Surely there were other comfortable private spaces available. Some of the younger staff members argued that they were being too sentimental, that life had to move forward. But the older guards, the ones who had served Queen Elizabeth for decades, could not shake the feeling that something precious was being disrespected. Thomas had grown up in a small village near Balmoral. His father had been a gamekeeper on the estate, and his grandfather had worked in the castle gardens. Service to the royal family was in his blood. He had been just 19 years old when he first put on the uniform of a royal guard. Queen Elizabeth had spoken to him personally on his first day, thanking him for his service and making him feel that his role mattered. Over the years, he had stood guard during state visits, royal weddings, and solemn funerals. He had protected the Queen through threats and scares that the public never knew about. His loyalty was absolute. That loyalty now felt tested in ways he had never imagined. Thomas was not a man who spoke out of turn or questioned authority. He had always believed in the chain of command and in respecting the decisions of his superiors. But this situation was different. It touched something deep inside him, something about honor and memory and the debt owed to a woman who had dedicated 70 years to her country. As he stood in the cold morning air, watching the sun begin to rise over the mountains, Thomas wondered what would happen next. Would anyone in a position of power understand why this mattered so much? Would they see that this was not about being difficult or resistant to change? It was about preserving the memory of a queen who had asked for so little for herself and had given everything to her people. The tension in the castle was growing, and Thomas knew that something would have to give. The question was what and how much damage would be done before this situation was resolved. The situation at Balmoral Castle grew more complicated with each passing day. Sarah Henderson, one of the senior housekeepers, found herself caught in an impossible position. She had received direct instructions from Queen Camilla's private secretary to prepare the late Queen Elizabeth's chambers for regular use. This meant more than just keeping them clean. It meant making them comfortable and personalized for the new queen. Sarah had always prided herself on her professionalism. She had worked at Balmoral for 18 years and had never questioned an order before. But as she stood outside those familiar doors, holding fresh linens and new toiletries, she felt her hands trembling. Inside those rooms were memories she had helped create and preserve. She remembered bringing the queen her morning tea, watching her smile at the view from her window, listening to her gentle questions about Sarah's family and children. The guards were not the only ones upset. The entire household staff had divided into two camps. Some believed they needed to accept that times had changed and that Queen Camilla had every right to use the rooms. Others felt that rushing to repurpose Queen Elizabeth's private spaces showed a lack of respect for her memory. The division was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere throughout the castle. James Wright, the senior palace aide, tried to mediate the situation. He had served the royal family for 40 years and had seen many changes during his career. He understood both sides of the argument. From an official perspective, Queen Camilla was now the queen, and royal residences belonged to the monarchy, not to individuals. The rooms would be used again eventually, so perhaps it was better to move forward rather than turn them into a shrine. However, James also understood the emotional attachment that the long-serving staff felt toward Queen Elizabeth. She had not been just their employer. She had been a constant presence in their lives, someone who had shown them kindness and appreciation over decades of service. Many of them had never worked for anyone else. Their entire adult lives had been spent in service to her, and her death had left a void that nothing could fill. The tension reached a breaking point during a staff meeting in the castle's old servants' hall. The meeting had been called to address scheduling and preparations for the royal family's extended summer stay. But within minutes, the conversation had turned to the elephant in the room. Thomas McGregor, usually so disciplined and controlled, found himself speaking up in front of everyone. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion as he explained how the guards felt. They were not trying to be difficult or disloyal to the new king and queen. They simply needed more time. Queen Elizabeth had only been gone for less than 2 years. Her presence still filled every corner of Balmoral. Using her most private rooms so soon felt premature and hurtful. Could there not be a period of respect? A time when those spaces remained as she had left them? Other staff members nodded in agreement. Mrs. Peterson, who had been the Queen's personal maid, spoke through tears about how she still expected to see Her Majesty walking through the corridors. Mr. Davies, the head butler, mentioned that even King Charles seemed to avoid those particular rooms, perhaps out of his own sense of loss and respect for his mother. The palace aide listened carefully to everyone's concerns. He promised to convey their feelings to the appropriate authorities, though he could not guarantee what the response would be. The royal household operated according to protocols and decisions made at the highest levels. Individual staff members, no matter how long they had served, had limited influence over such matters. After the meeting, small groups of staff members gathered in corners, continuing the discussion in hushed voices. Some were angry, feeling that their concerns would be dismissed. Others were worried about their jobs, fearing that speaking out might mark them as troublemakers. A few remained silent, uncomfortable with the conflict and wishing everything would just return to normal. Queen Camilla herself seemed unaware of the storm brewing among the household staff. She had always found Balmoral a bit intimidating, knowing how much Queen Elizabeth had loved it. The castle held decades of memories that did not include her. Every portrait on the walls, every piece of furniture, every tradition observed there was connected to the late Queen. Camilla had been trying to find her own place within these ancient walls, to feel comfortable in a role she had never expected to hold. Her decision to use the private quarters had not been made lightly or with any intention to cause offense. She had genuinely needed a quiet space, somewhere she could retreat from the constant observation and expectations. The rooms happened to be available and beautifully appointed. In her mind, she was simply using facilities that belonged to the royal family. She had not realized that the staff would view her actions as a violation of sacred ground. The misunderstanding highlighted a deeper issue within the royal household. Communication between the family and their staff had always been filtered through layers of private secretaries, aides, and household managers. Direct conversations about feelings and concerns rarely happened. Everyone operated within their defined roles, and crossing those boundaries felt uncomfortable and inappropriate. As the evening fell over Balmoral, the castle seemed heavier somehow, as if the building itself sensed the discord within its walls. Thomas returned to his post, his mind troubled by the day's events. He loved his job and had never imagined feeling this way about his service. The royal family had been his life's purpose, and now he felt torn between his duty and his conscience. Somewhere inside those stone walls, decisions were being made that would affect everyone who called Balmoral their workplace and their second home. The news of the staff's discontent did not take long to reach beyond the castle walls. A young footman, frustrated and emotional after the staff meeting, had mentioned something to his brother during a phone call. The brother, not understanding the sensitivity of the information, had shared it with a friend who worked as a journalist. Within days, whispers about tension at Balmoral began circulating in media circles. Royal correspondents started making discreet inquiries. They contacted former staff members, local residents near the estate, and anyone who might have information about what was happening inside the castle. The story was too compelling to ignore. The public had adored Queen Elizabeth, and any suggestion that her memory was not being properly honored would generate intense interest and strong reactions. Thomas first learned about the media attention when the head of security called an emergency meeting with all the guards. They were warned to be extremely careful about any conversations, even with family members. Under no circumstances should anyone speak to journalists. The palace was watching the situation closely, and anyone who leaked information would face immediate dismissal and possible legal action. The warning only increased the tension. The guards felt they were being silenced, prevented from expressing legitimate concerns. Some began to wonder if their feelings even mattered to the people making decisions. They had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, often at personal sacrifice. Their families had endured long absences, missed holidays, and constant relocations. Now, when they raised a concern about something deeply meaningful to them, they were threatened with punishment. Inside the castle, Queen Camilla had been informed about the situation by her private secretary. The news had shocked and upset her. She had never intended to cause distress to the staff or to disrespect Queen Elizabeth's memory. In fact, she held tremendous admiration for her late mother-in-law and had always felt somewhat inadequate in comparison to such a remarkable woman. Camilla sat in her study, which was not in the contested quarters, trying to understand what had gone wrong. She had been following the advice of her staff, doing what she thought was expected of a queen. The idea that her actions had hurt people she relied on every day troubled her deeply. She was not the villain that some people wanted to paint her as. She was simply a woman trying to navigate an impossibly complex role in an ancient institution. King Charles was also struggling with the situation. He loved Balmoral with all his heart. It had been his mother's favorite place, and he had spent countless happy summers there as a child and throughout his life. The thought that his wife's presence in his mother's rooms was causing pain to the loyal staff weighed heavily on him. Yet he also needed to support Camilla and help her feel comfortable in her role as queen. He called a private meeting with James Wright, the senior aide, to discuss potential solutions. The king listened carefully as James explained the depth of feeling among the household staff. These were not people being unreasonable or resistant to change. They were grieving, and they needed time to process their loss before seeing the late queen's most personal spaces transformed. The king understood this completely. He himself had not been ready to sort through his mother's belongings or change anything about her private rooms. He had been avoiding those quarters entirely, letting them remain exactly as she had left them. Perhaps he had been in denial about the need to eventually address those spaces. Perhaps he had assumed that more time would pass before anyone would want to use them. Together, they began to formulate a plan. The king would speak directly to Camilla and explain the situation more fully. They would find alternative quarters for her use. Rooms that were equally comfortable, but without the emotional weight attached to them. The late queen's private chambers would remain preserved for now, the future decision to be made about their ultimate purpose. Perhaps they could eventually become a private memorial space, open only to family members who wanted to feel close to her memory. Meanwhile, the king would also address the household staff directly. He wanted them to know that their service was valued and that their feelings mattered to him. He understood their attachment to his mother and shared their desire to honor her properly. This was not about choosing sides or determining who was right or wrong. It was about finding a way forward that respected everyone's needs and feelings. The announcement of the king's planned address to the staff spread quickly through the castle. Some people felt hopeful that a resolution was possible. Others remained skeptical, wondering if this was just damage control to prevent a larger scandal. Thomas found himself somewhere in between. He wanted to believe that his concerns had been heard. But years of experience had taught him that royal households often prioritized appearance over substance. The night before the king's address, Thomas could not sleep. He walked the castle grounds in the darkness, looking up at the windows of Queen Elizabeth's quarters. He remembered standing in almost this exact spot years ago, during one of her summer stays. She had appeared at the window, noticed him below, and given him a small wave. It was such a simple gesture, but it had made him feel seen and appreciated. That was what they were all fighting for, really. Not just rooms or furniture or protocols. They were fighting to preserve the feeling that Queen Elizabeth got created through decades of kindness and genuine care for the people who served her. They wanted to ensure that her legacy was not just about duty and service in the abstract, but about the real human connections she had valued and nurtured as the sun began to rise over the Scottish Highlands once again. Thomas felt a small measure of hope. Perhaps the king understood what was at stake. Perhaps changes would be made that honored both the past and the present. Only time would tell whether this conflict would tear the household apart or bring them closer together through honest communication and mutual respect. The morning of the king's address arrived with unusual stillness over Balmoral Castle. Staff members gathered in the Grand Hall, a room normally used for formal occasions and state functions. Many of them had served together for decades, yet the atmosphere felt strangely awkward and uncertain. They did not know what to expect from this unprecedented meeting. King Charles entered the room quietly, without the usual formal announcement. He wanted this to feel like a conversation rather than a royal proclamation. He looked tired, and those who knew him well could see the strain of the past weeks on his face. Losing his mother had been devastating, and now he was navigating his new role while trying to keep peace within his household. He began by thanking everyone for their years of service, not just to him but to his late mother. He spoke about how much Queen Elizabeth had valued the staff at Balmoral. She had always said that this castle felt like home because of the people who cared for it. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned her name, revealing that his grief was still raw and close to the surface. Then he addressed the situation directly. He acknowledged that changes had been made to his mother's private quarters. Without proper consideration for the feelings of those who had cared for those rooms with devotion, he admitted that in the rush of adjusting to new responsibilities and routines, sensitivity had been lost. The staff's concerns were valid and deserved to be heard and respected. Thomas felt something release in his chest as he listened. Simply hearing the king acknowledge their feelings made a tremendous difference. They had not been demanding anything unreasonable. They had just wanted their grief and their loyalty to the late queen to be recognized and honored. The king continued by announcing concrete changes. Queen Camilla would be moving to a different suite of rooms in the castle, ones that were equally comfortable but carried no personal connection to Queen Elizabeth. The late queen's private quarters would be preserved as they were, maintained by the staff with the same care they had always shown. Eventually, the family would decide together what the ultimate purpose of those rooms should be. But for now, they would remain untouched. Furthermore, The king announced that he was establishing a formal memorial committee made up of both family members and long-serving staff. This committee would be responsible for planning appropriate ways to honor Queen Elizabeth's memory at Balmoral and ensuring that her legacy at the castle was preserved for future generations. Several of the senior staff members, including Thomas, would be invited to serve on this committee. The relief in the room was palpable. Some of the older housekeepers wiped tears from their eyes. The younger staff members, who had been caught between loyalty to their colleagues and confusion about the conflict, looked visibly more relaxed. This was not about winning or losing. It was about finding a solution that acknowledged everyone's needs and feelings. After the formal address, the king did something that surprised everyone. Instead of leaving immediately, he stayed to speak with individual staff members. He moved through the room, asking people about their families, thanking them personally for specific services they had provided to his mother. He spent several minutes talking with Margaret, the head housekeeper, who had been so distressed by the changes. He listened as she shared memories of the late queen and assured her that those memories were precious and would be protected. When the king reached Thomas, he shook his hand firmly and looked him directly in the eyes. He thanked Thomas for his courage in speaking up, even when it had been difficult and uncomfortable. He said that the royal family needed people like Thomas, individuals who cared enough to ensure that important values were not lost in the march of progress and change. Thomas had served the monarchy his entire adult life, but this brief conversation meant more to him than any medal or commendation ever could. He felt truly seen and valued, not just as a guard, but as a person whose opinions and feelings mattered. Queen Camilla also made an appearance toward the end of the gathering. She had been nervous about facing the staff, worried that they hated her or saw her as an intruder trying to erase Queen Elizabeth's presence. But she had insisted on coming, on addressing the situation directly rather than hiding behind official statements and intermediaries. She spoke briefly but sincerely. She apologized for any pain her actions had caused and explained that she had never intended disrespect toward Queen Elizabeth's memory. She acknowledged that she was still learning how to navigate her role and that she would make mistakes along the way. She asked for patience and promised to listen more carefully to the people who knew the royal household best. Her vulnerability and honesty surprised many of the staff members. They had built up an image of her in their minds, casting her as someone cold and calculating. But the woman standing before them was clearly struggling with her own insecurities and grief. She had lost her mother-in-law, someone she had grown to care for deeply despite their complicated history. She was trying to fill shoes that could never truly be filled, and she was doing so under intense scrutiny and pressure. Sarah Henderson, who had been so conflicted about preparing the contested rooms, found herself feeling unexpected compassion for Queen Camilla. The queen was not the enemy. She was simply another person caught in circumstances beyond anyone's complete control. The real challenge was how they would all move forward together, creating new traditions while honoring old ones. As the gathering concluded, people filed out of the grand hall in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically from just an hour before. There was still sadness, still grief for the loss of Queen Elizabeth, but there was also hope that they could navigate this transition with grace and mutual respect. Thomas walked back to his post, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The problem had not been solved perfectly, but it had been addressed honestly and with genuine care for everyone involved. That was all anyone could really ask for in such a complicated situation. In the weeks following the king's address, Balmoral Castle began to feel different. The heavy tension that had hung over the household slowly lifted, replaced by a tentative sense of cooperation and understanding. Staff members who had been divided into opposing camps started talking to each other again, finding common ground in their shared love for the castle and their dedication to serving the royal family. The memorial committee held its first meeting in the castle library, a cozy room filled with books that Queen Elizabeth had collected over her lifetime. Thomas found himself sitting at a table with other long-serving staff members, along with several members of the royal family, including Princess Anne, who had always been known for her no-nonsense approach and deep respect for tradition. The committee's task was both important and delicate. They needed to find ways to honor Queen Elizabeth's memory at Balmoral without turning the castle into a museum frozen in time. The royal family would continue to use Balmoral for generations to come, and it needed to remain a living, functioning residence rather than simply a monument to the past. Princess Anne proved to be an invaluable voice on the committee. She understood both the family's perspective and the staff's deep emotional connection to her mother. She shared stories about growing up at Balmoral, about her mother's love for the Scottish Highlands and the peace she found there. She also made clear that her mother would not have wanted people to stop living their lives or to treat her memory as something fragile that would shatter if touched. The committee proposed several meaningful tributes. They would create a private garden on the estate, designed with flowers and plants that Queen Elizabeth had particularly loved. This would be a place where family members and staff could go to feel close to her memory, to sit quietly and reflect. They would also establish a photographic exhibition in one of the castle's public rooms, showing the Queen's life at Balmoral through the decades, from a young princess to a beloved grandmother. Most importantly, they decided that Queen Elizabeth's private sitting room would be preserved exactly as she had left it, accessible only to close family members who wanted to spend time there. The bedroom and other private spaces would eventually be repurposed when the time felt right, but that small sitting room would remain as a personal memorial. It felt like the right balance between honoring the past and allowing the castle to continue functioning for the present and future. Thomas appreciated being part of these decisions. For so long, he and the other guards had felt powerless, watching changes happen without any input or consideration for their perspective. Now they were being treated as partners in preserving the Queen's legacy, and their decades of observation and service were being valued as genuine expertise. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla had settled into her new quarters without any fanfare or complaint. The rooms were beautiful and comfortable, with lovely views of the gardens and mountains. She had worked with the household staff to arrange things to her taste. But she was careful to ask rather than demand, to suggest rather than order. The experience of the past weeks had taught her important lessons about communication and sensitivity. She began spending time getting to know the staff members better, learning their names and showing interest in their lives. She asked Margaret about her grandchildren and complimented Sarah on how beautifully she maintained the household linens. These were small gestures, but they mattered enormously to people who had felt overlooked and undervalued. One afternoon, Camilla encountered Thomas during one of her walks around the castle grounds. She stopped to speak with him, thanking him again for his honesty during the difficult period. She admitted that becoming queen had been overwhelming, as she often felt inadequate compared to the remarkable woman who had held the role before her. She had been trying so hard to establish her place that she had failed to consider how her actions affected others. Thomas found himself reassuring her, explaining that the staff understood the impossible position she was in. Nobody expected her to be Queen Elizabeth. They just needed her to respect what the late queen had meant to them. As long as she did that, they would support her completely in her new role. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. From that day forward, there was a mutual respect and understanding between Queen Camilla and the household staff at Balmoral. They would never have the same bond that had existed with Queen Elizabeth, but they were building something new that honored the past while moving forward into the future. The media attention that had threatened to explode into a major scandal gradually faded away. Official statements from the palace mentioned that the royal family was working on memorial plans for Queen Elizabeth at Balmoral, but no details of the internal conflict were ever publicly confirmed. The staff members who had been so angry and hurt felt satisfied that their concerns had been addressed, privately and respectfully, without needing to air everything in the press. As autumn approached, and the royal family prepared to leave Balmoral for the season, there was a sense of closure and peace. The crisis had tested everyone involved, forcing difficult conversations and challenging long-held assumptions. But ultimately it had led to positive changes and deeper understanding on the last day of the summer season, while Thomas stood at his post watching as the royal cars prepared to depart. King Charles stopped to shake hands with each of the guards personally, thanking them for their service over the summer. Queen Camilla did the same, with a warm smile and genuine appreciation in her eyes. The household staff gathered to wave goodbye, a tradition that had been followed for generations. As the cars disappeared down the long driveway, Thomas looked up at the castle windows. Somewhere inside, Queen Elizabeth's sitting room remained exactly as she had left it, a quiet testament to a life of extraordinary service and devotion. The room would be there for years to come, a private space where those who loved her could feel her presence and remember her. With gratitude and affection, the situation had not been perfect, and feelings had been hurt on all sides. But in the end, people had come together, listened to each other, and found solutions that honored both tradition and change. That, Thomas reflected, would have made Queen Elizabeth proud. She had always believed in the importance of service, respect, and treating people with dignity regardless of their position or title. The following summer, when the royal family returned to Balmoral, the atmosphere was entirely different from the previous year. The wounds had healed, and in their place had grown something stronger and more resilient. The household staff welcomed King Charles and Queen Camilla with genuine warmth, and there was a sense of unity that had been forged through the difficult experiences they had shared. The memorial garden for Queen Elizabeth had been completed during the winter months. It was a stunning tribute, filled with her favorite roses, lavender, and wildflowers native to the Scottish Highlands. A simple stone bench sat in the center, engraved with words from one of her favorite poems about Scotland. The garden was not grand or ostentatious, but it was peaceful and beautiful, exactly as she would have wanted. During the first week of their stay, the entire household gathered for a private dedication ceremony for the garden. King Charles spoke movingly about his mother's love for Balmoral and her deep appreciation for everyone who had made it such a special place. Princess Anne unveiled the memorial plaque, and several long-serving staff members shared their favorite memories of the late Queen. Thomas was asked to say a few words representing the household staff. He spoke simply and from the heart about what Queen Elizabeth had meant to all of them. She had been more than an employer or a monarch. She had been a constant presence in their lives, someone who had treated them with kindness and respect regardless of their position. She had made them feel that their work mattered, that they were part of something important and meaningful. As Thomas spoke, he noticed Queen Camilla wiping tears from her eyes. She had come to understand during the past year how deep the love for Queen Elizabeth ran, and she had stopped seeing it as competition or comparison. Instead, she recognized it as the natural response to a truly remarkable woman who had touched countless lives through simple acts of decency and consideration. After the ceremony, people wandered through the garden in small groups, enjoying the flowers and the tranquility. The garden quickly became a beloved feature of the estate, a place where staff members would take their breaks and where family members would come to sit and think. It was not morbid or sad, but rather a celebration of a life well lived and a reminder of the values that Queen Elizabeth had embodied. The photographic exhibition had also been installed in the castle. It traced Queen Elizabeth's relationship with Balmoral from her childhood visits through to her final summer there. The images showed her laughing with her family, walking her beloved corgis, fishing in the river, and simply enjoying the natural beauty of the Highlands. Visitors to the castle, both family and official guests, often spent time studying these photographs and marveling at the span of history they represented. Most significantly, the preserved sitting room had become exactly what the Memorial Committee had hoped it would be. It was not open to tourists or turned into a public exhibition. Instead, it remained a private sanctuary where close family members could go when they needed to feel connected to Queen Elizabeth. Her grandchildren would sometimes sit there reading, feeling her presence in the room. King Charles would occasionally have his morning tea there, looking at the same view his mother had loved so much. The household staff continued to maintain the room with the same devotion they had always shown. Fresh flowers appeared on the table every week. The books on the shelves were dusted carefully. The room felt alive somehow, even though it remained frozen in time. It was proof that memory and honoring the past could coexist with moving forward into the future. Queen Camilla had found her own place at Balmoral. She had developed genuine friendships with several of the staff members, particularly Margaret, who had become an unofficial advisor on household matters and royal protocol. Camilla often sought Margaret's advice on everything from menu planning to dealing with difficult situations. The two women had formed an unlikely bond. Built on mutual respect and honest communication, Thomas noticed that Queen Camilla had also started some of her own traditions at Balmoral. She established a weekly tea for the household staff where people could come and chat informally about their concerns or suggestions. She created a scholarship fund for the children of estate workers, helping them pursue education and opportunities. These initiatives did not replace or compete with Queen Elizabeth's legacy. They simply added new layers to the ongoing story of the royal family at Balmoral. The young footman who had inadvertently leaked information to his brother had learned a valuable lesson about discretion and the consequences of careless talk. He had not been fired, as many had feared, but he had received a stern warning and had to work hard to rebuild trust with his colleagues. The experience had matured him, teaching him that being part of the royal household came with serious responsibilities. One evening near the end of summer, Thomas stood at his usual post as the sun set over the mountains. He reflected on everything that had happened over the past year. The crisis that had seemed so catastrophic at the time had ultimately led to positive changes and deeper understanding among everyone at Balmoral. They had learned to communicate more openly, to value each other's perspectives, and to find ways to honor tradition while embracing necessary change. He thought about Queen Elizabeth and felt confident that she would have been pleased with how things had turned out. She had always believed in bringing people together, in finding common ground, and in treating everyone with respect and kindness. The memorial they had created for her was not just the garden or the photographs or the preserved room. It was the way they had chosen to work through their differences and build something positive from a painful situation. As Thomas prepared to end his shift, he saw Queen Camilla walking in the memorial garden with Margaret. They were chatting companionably, and Camilla was admiring the late summer roses. It was a simple scene, but it represented everything that had changed over the past year. Two people from very different worlds had found a way to connect and support each other, building bridges across the divides that might have kept them apart. The lessons learned at Balmoral that difficult summer had rippled outward to affect how things were done at other royal residences as well. There was now greater emphasis on consulting with long-serving staff members before making significant changes. The royal family had come to appreciate that these individuals possessed institutional knowledge and emotional intelligence that could not be replaced or ignored. Their perspectives made the transition of power smoother and more respectful of the traditions that gave the monarchy its strength and continuity. King Charles had also taken the experience to heart in his broader approach to his new role. He had always been thoughtful and progressive in his thinking, but the situation at Balmoral had taught him the importance of moving at a pace that allowed people to adjust emotionally, not just logistically. Change was necessary and inevitable, but it needed to be implemented with sensitivity to the human cost and with respect for the attachments. People formed over decades of loyal service. Sarah Henderson, the housekeeper who had trembled at the thought of changing Queen Elizabeth's rooms, had found peace with the resolution. She still maintained those preserved quarters with loving care, but she no longer felt the crushing weight of grief every time she entered. The memorial garden gave her a place to process her feelings, and the knowledge that the royal family truly valued Queen Elizabeth's legacy brought her comfort. She could honor the past while also embracing her duties in the present. The other guards who had stood alongside Thomas during the difficult period felt vindicated and respected. Their concerns had been heard, and meaningful action had been taken in response. This experience strengthened their loyalty to King Charles because they knew he was a man who listened and who cared about the people who served him. They would protect him and his family with even greater dedication because of the respect he had shown them. As the years passed, the incident became part of Balmoral's history. A story told to new staff members is an example of how conflicts could be resolved with honesty and mutual respect. The castle had witnessed many dramas over its long existence, but this particular episode stood out because it had ended not with bitterness or division, but with understanding and growth. The memorial garden matured beautifully, the plants growing stronger and more established with each passing season. The roses that Queen Elizabeth had loved bloomed faithfully every summer. their fragrance filling the air and bringing smiles to everyone who passed by. Children and grandchildren who had never known their great-grandmother played in the garden. Stories about her were shared there, keeping her memory alive for new generations. Thomas eventually retired after 30 years of service to the royal family. On his last day, King Charles presented him with a special commendation, recognizing not just his years of faithful service, but specifically his courage in speaking up during a difficult time. The king told him that his willingness to voice uncomfortable truths had helped prevent a situation that could have damaged relationships permanently. Thomas treasured that recognition more than anything else he received during his retirement ceremony. Queen Camilla also thanked Thomas privately, telling him that his honesty had helped her become a better queen. She had learned from the experience to listen more carefully, to consider the emotional impact of decisions, and to recognize that respect for the past and hope for the future were not opposing forces, but complementary values that could coexist beautifully. On his final walk through the castle grounds, Thomas stopped at the memorial garden. He sat on the stone bench and looked at the mountains in the distance. The same view that Queen Elizabeth had cherished for so many decades. He felt her presence there, not as a ghost or a haunting memory, but as a living legacy of kindness, duty, and service that would continue to inspire everyone who had known her. The situation that had once seemed like an impossible conflict had transformed into something meaningful and lasting. It had brought people together, forced necessary conversations, and ultimately created a stronger, more unified household. The royal family at Balmoral had learned to balance tradition with progress, to honor the past while building the future, and to value every person who contributed to making the castle a home rather than just a building. As Thomas left Balmoral for the last time, he knew that the castle and everyone in it would be fine. They had proven that they could face challenges together, that they could speak honestly about difficult feelings, and that they could find solutions that respected everyone involved. Queen Elizabeth's legacy was secure, not because her rooms remained unchanged, but because the values she had embodied continued to guide the people who had loved and served her. The story of the royal guard's fury over Queen Camilla's access to the private quarters had ended not with anger or resentment, but with understanding, growth, and a deeper appreciation for the complex human emotions that existed beneath the formal protocols of royal life. It was a reminder that even in the most traditional and hierarchical institutions, people's feelings mattered, and taking the time to address them properly could transform potential disasters into opportunities for positive change.